Inshallah, we have 2 sessions left. Today is session 5 and one more week. So even though we've now gone beyond the original planned time, inshallah, those people who are able to, we will do a session. We are doing a session right now, and we will do one more session next week, inshallah. Okay, please feel free to at any time take up the mic and comment or ask any questions. I'm gonna get started with a quick recap of what we've done, where we are, and then inshallah some new content. So yeah, we are in unit 2 of this series of Islamic beliefs following the Farsi books that you can see called Binihayat. Okay, this is the author. His name is Sheikh Muhammad Hassan Wakili from Mashhad, sorry. A very outstanding scholar, very clearly from his works. He is a student of somebody called Allama Tehrani. Beyond that, he's a very famous or very well-rounded scholar of the Hausa, but one of his main teachers in matters of akhlaq and spirituality is Allama Tehrani. This Allama Tehrani was a student of both Allama Tabatabai and also an individual who we will talk about today called Sayyid Hashim Haddad. Okay, so I have a story, inshallah, very soon I will narrate an interesting story about this Sayyid Hashim, which is very much related to our discussion. So far, we've discussed a few different things. We talked in the beginning about Alamul Ghaib and Alamul Shahada, the hidden world. Beyond that, we talked a little bit about how in an Islamic paradigm, we have different realms. When we say Alamul Ghaib, it means there is like a realm called the Alamul Mithal or Barzakh, and then there are higher realms of the Aql. Then in the last few sessions, we've been talking about my body versus I. Okay, I'm going to recap these 6 proofs that we went through. And this was really like some of the main discussion. Even today, it's now going to be just a kind of a follow-up of that. Today, we want to look at the relationship between the body and the soul. First, we're going to recap and, in fact, add some of what we already talked about, these 6 proofs of proving the immaterial nature of the soul. So that is really the bulk of what we wanted to cover, which, alhamdulillah, we have pretty much finished now. So today we'll talk a little bit more about my body versus I, then we'll talk about this relationship of the soul and the body and show how there is a two-way relationship where the body affects the soul and the soul also drives and affects the body itself. Okay? Inshallah, in the final session, I will try to give you notes. Inshallah, I will email both notes for today and at least one, if not 2 sets of notes for next week. Next week, we want to quickly go through 2 topics, inshallah. One, we'll talk about what is the perfection of the soul after we have established the existence of an immaterial soul, and after today's discussion of about how the body influences the soul, we'll go back to a discussion about the perfection of the soul, which for those of you who were there for the last session on Ma'rifat Shanasi, the very opening discussion we had on Ma'rifat Shanasi about spiritual pleasure and like higher pleasures being the true goal or true kind of happiness that we should seek, this will somehow go back to that again. And we'll talk about how the perfection of the soul is in proximity to Allah and higher kind of pleasures than the physical world can give us. A final discussion, which we will try to also cover next week, is some concepts about Allah. If we don't get around to doing it next week, inshallah, in the future, we will have unit 3 of Islamic beliefs. The next discussion we want to go into is theology and about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if we don't cover it next week, we will cover it in a later class, inshallah, where we now somehow compare some of what we learned about the immaterial nature of the soul. It can teach us about the relationship between God and the creation. So that's also really important and really, really interesting. Okay, but for today, we want to somehow just quickly recap. We went through 6, those of you who listened to the recording that we sent last week, we finished this off. We went through six different, over 2 weeks, we went through six different, um, inshallah, everybody's doing well. I see some new students have joined. Um, we went through six different proofs for the immaterial nature of the soul. One, we had talked about the idea that we are an existence that exists at three different levels. We have our physical body, but dreams and our imagination, memory, things like this prove that we are at an immaterial level. And in fact, those immaterial levels are of two different types. So that proves that we exist at three different levels. And us being an existence, that itself proves that there are three different levels of existence altogether. That was kind of also related to our view of the universe. But the proof here was about the immaterial nature of the soul, that just thinking about knowledge, thinking about dreams, things like that prove that we are not just a physical body. Okay. Then in the last session, there were two discussions that were a bit philosophical, a bit difficult. There's a lot of depth here that obviously we can't even open up completely, but it was looking at the attributes of the material world and then comparing that to the attributes of the human soul. And for example, we said that I'm going to add something to the second proof shortly, but just to kind of recap what we said last week in the recording, we said that the material physical world is constantly in motion, constantly changing. As opposed to that, our soul has stability in it. Okay, I'm going to add some more things to that shortly. Then the third proof, we said that the physical world is made up of particles that are separate from one another. There is no unity. If you look at a physical machine, a bicycle, a computer, it might appear to be one thing, but it's actually just, if you open it up a bit, it's just atoms that are next to each other or parts. If you were to ask that computer or anything, for example, just imagine it could talk to us. Okay, you're to ask it, what are you? There's no real oneness there. It is just a whole bunch of separate physical things that have been grouped together. As opposed to that, a human soul has a true unity. We are something that as we age, this concept becomes even stronger and more powerful, maybe. It's not something that is, changing as our body is changing. In fact, it is the reality, the single reality that we are, is what sees and hears and tastes and remembers and acts. Okay, so there's this idea that we are one reality as opposed to everything in the physical world. In the physical world, there's no oneness, there is only multiplicity. Okay, and then those were like I said, those two proofs were a little bit complicated. Then there were three nice and easy proofs. There was one about dreams. Here, I'm not saying dreams in the sense of proving the alam-e-mithal or alam-e-barzakh. I'm just saying people have had dreams where they saw dead people and they spoke to those deceased individuals. They spoke to the soul of that person. If that person has died, how is it that they are coming in somebody else's dream? That proves that there is a immaterial soul that has remained alive and can communicate with the soul of the person who is sleeping, who is in a dream. Okay. We talked about near-death experiences. I showed you a clip from a Farsi TV show, Zindagi Pasas Zindagi. And there are even, I referred you to nderf.org and even English literature that is out there documenting near-death experiences. How people who they call it near death, but maybe from an Islamic perspective, we would say actually the people died and came back to life. And in that time when they died, amazing things happened. They could remember that their soul was watching the people around them. They were watching the doctors, for example, those people who were in the hospital. They could maybe at times travel far away, see what was happening in another country, go back in time, see their past, and then they woke up again and they remembered all of that. Okay, so again, that's something that cannot be explained unless you believe in the immaterial nature of the soul. And the last proof, which I wanted to give you an account of right now, are the experiences not of near death, not of dreams, but of living awake experiences of mystics, of pious individuals, people who witnessed certain realities which cannot be explained unless with the immaterial belief of the soul, basically. Okay, so I have a story right now to give you about that. That one of these individuals, this is his picture over here, Sayyid Hashim al Haddad. Sayyid Hashim was somebody who lived in Karbala, I think, not Najaf, Karbala, and he was a student of Sayyid Qadi, this great famous mystic of recent times. Sayyid Hashim himself passed away maybe about 40 years ago, little bit more than 40 years ago. Really interesting story. Okay, lots of lessons in this. He narrates that he was somebody who was going through a lot of difficulty. He was very poor. And one of the things that was really, really troubling him was his mother in law. Okay, so some points about his life here on these slides. He lived in the same building as his mother-in-law and father-in-law. There was like a courtyard, the way these Eastern houses, I'm sure many of you have seen. There's a courtyard in the middle, and there was like a building on one side where his in-laws lived, and a building on the other side where him and his wife lived. His father-in-law loved him a lot, very nice person, but his mother-in-law detested him. She hated him, and she was like a very harsh, strong, abusive, verbally, physically abusive woman. Okay, and the in-laws had a lot of money, had a lot of food. They used to store like rice and things in their house, but she made it a point to make sure that none of that would go to her son-in-law. Okay, and her son-in-law, the Sayyid Hashim, he was Haddad. He was like a blacksmith. He was not wearing the libas of an alim. He was not somebody who was an alim by profession, but he had attained a high level of spirituality. He was being trained by Sayyid Qadi in his spiritual path. And because of these spiritual states that he was in, he didn't want to hold on to money. He was very quick in helping the poor, and people would come to him and take loans from him. And he didn't amass money. He lived in a lot of poverty. Okay. And his mother in law somehow found that really bad and used to abuse him even more because of his poverty. At a certain point, he was finding his marriage very difficult. Like his wife, he loved his wife, they got along generally well, but because of this whole situation, he wanted to divorce his wife. But his teacher Sayyid Qadi told him, no, you're not allowed to divorce your wife. In this, difficulty is a spiritual training for you, basically. You need to keep persisting and have patience. And so he did so, and a time came that basically one day, it was like a hot summer day, he came back home and was exhausted, he was tired, and his mother-in-law was there in the courtyard. As soon as she saw him, she started abusing him, shouting at him really loudly. The neighbors could hear, but he didn't say anything. He walked away, he went to the roof. And eventually, like, he left the house. He was just controlling his tongue. He didn't say anything back to her. He left the house altogether, and he had some kind of spiritual unveiling at that point, where he says, in this state, suddenly I saw that I became two. There were two of me. One was the Sayyid Hashim, who this mother-in-law was cursing and transgressing, and one was a very exalted reality, some like reality of his soul that, no matter what she said, that higher reality of who he was could never be cursed, and was never going to be affected. And basically, whatever that means, he had some spiritual unveiling, some reality was shown to him that goes back to a proof that we are not just a physical reality. Okay, he saw himself now as two people. One is a lower Sayyid Hashim, and one is something greater, something higher. And so that's kind of itself a proof. The account of such people is itself a sanad, itself an authentic source that shows to us that we are not just a physical body, and that's it. Okay, I have some more points. Again, I want to, encourage you guys to comment or see anything if you have any questions. I have another point I wanted to add, or maybe just kind of further clarify the second proof. I said the second and third proof were a little bit difficult. They were philosophical discussions that, do need more prerequisites than we could possibly do in this class. But very briefly, I'll add some more points about that, and then I will open a question and take a break to go pray. It has become Fajr time over here. But yeah, the point that I wanted to make now is about this idea of the second proof, where I said one of the philosophical proofs is that the physical world is constantly changing, whereas we realize that we are not constantly changing. Okay? I want to divide this into two aspects. If we kind of look into ourselves, one is our memory and our knowledge. Okay, if the materialists, if the atheists were to come and say that, oh, there's no immaterial knowledge, no immaterial soul, your memory, your memory is just what your brain cells were somehow affected by what you saw yesterday. And today, when you want to compare what happened yesterday to today, you're just like comparing two different types of brain cells. There are brain cells that have the impact and the effect of yesterday, and there are brain cells that are being impacted by today. So, because of that, you can do a comparison in your brain, and there's nothing immaterial, right? In response to that, we would say that, okay, this is why, by the way, that the Islamic belief discussion, I was trying to emphasize, it really depends on epistemology, right? One of the things we said in Ma'rifat Shanasi in epistemology was that when you somehow recognize something to be true and you're 100% sure it's obvious for you, then there's no questioning it, right? It's like something that you've somehow recognized with your internal soul that it is the case. Okay, so one thing is that we're not, when we think about our memory, that's not what we're doing. We're not analyzing cells that have changed. We're actually remembering yesterday. When I think back to a memory of yesterday, or forget yesterday, like 30, 40 years ago, I can remember what happened to me at times. And that's not something that it's, when I think about it, when I recognize what I'm actually doing, it's not something that is like a part of my brain that has now had a leftover effect. Okay, we could go a step further and say that these materialists who are saying such a thing, in fact, they are now denying all knowledge. Why? Because there is nothing in your brain that is constant and stable. As soon as you want to think about 2 plus 2 equals 4, and then think about it again, okay, think about the concept 2 plus 2 equals 4. A moment later, when you think about it, all of your brain cells have changed. But you recognize, you know definitely that that knowledge that you have, 2 plus 2 equals 4, is the same knowledge that you had a minute ago. You recognize that that memory that you have of yesterday or 20, 30, 40 years ago is something stable that you actually know, that you can actually talk about and really remember. So the kind of the explanation being given here is that this materialistic, you know, purely physical explanation doesn't cut it. It doesn't work. Okay. One last thing is that another thing altogether is the idea of who I am. Okay, I kind of indicated this. This is like the idea we have of the reality of who we are. This is something similar, which again is very stable. Of course, we develop, we grow, we learn things, we maybe our closeness to God, inshallah, increases. We fast in the month of Ramadan, we feel spiritual. But there is a concept of who I am that doesn't change. If anything, it becomes more firmly kind of strong, but it is something that is constant and stable. And so, again, you can't explain such things if you just look at the physical body. The physical body is changing, cells are changing. All cells in the body probably change, are lost. I mean, they die and new cells come. And so, the only way to explain these concepts is that there is a dimension of us, an aspect of who we are that is immaterial, that is standard, that doesn't change. And that is the I, that is the me that is doing things. Anyways, there's a lot more to be said here, I'm sure, but I'm going to leave it at that. I want to pose a question now, which I had put in a homework assignment that only two of you, mashallah, two of the brothers here, actually did that homework assignment. I'm going to leave this with you guys to think about. And I'm going to go and pray, and then I'll come back and I want to hear from you. If we're saying that knowledge is something immaterial, which is what we're saying, okay, the idea of remembering, memory, knowledge is something very immaterial in this Islamic perspective. What about AI? Isn't AI a kind of knowledge? Today, AI is amazing. You can ask ChatGPT, you can talk to ChatGPT like it's a human being, and it will tell you lots of things. How do we explain that? Is there immaterial knowledge there or not? Inshallah. Okay. Think about this. Even if you guys have any other questions, any other comments, we talked about a lot of things to do with the immaterial nature of the soul. I wasn't with you last week. If you even listened to the recording, if you have any questions to do with that, inshallah, when I come back in about less than 10 minutes, I'll say Fajr prayers and come back. I'm happy to take your questions before we continue, inshallah.
Brother Elisa, did Sheikh say that you did the homework? I'm saying whoever did the homework should have the first dibs at this question.
Yeah, I guess like AI doesn't necessarily like have a conscience. Like it can't like make its own decisions because like the information it gives you when you ask it a question is just based on like algorithms and things that it's been provided. So it's just based on like programs, patterns. So it's not immaterial because it's based on something material, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, makes sense to me.
Is it possible to say, since AI is based upon human experiences, so the data of human experiences, can we say that AI is also experiencing as well?
I feel like you could also say like AI is maybe like a mirror to human knowledge or experience. And since we know like if you see yourself in a mirror, that's a virtual image, so it's not a real image. So like the
Hmm.
knowledge that AI has is not like real knowledge or immaterial knowledge. I guess you could maybe
So
say
it's
that.
solely reflecting.
Yeah, I guess. Because like AI only has like the capacity to the extent that humans can make it. So look, obviously Allah has created humans and Allah has a power much greater than humans do. So the way He creates the human mind is like a lot more complex than the way humans can create AI. So that's why AI can only do so much as because of the limitations that humans have. So I think the maximum capacity of AI is to only reflect the knowledge of humans. Of course, they can like process it faster, but it's like it has to get to that information and knowledge from somewhere. And that thing that it gets it from is probably not immaterial, unlike the way the human brain works, which is like through Allah's unique creation of the brain, it has an immaterial capacity that AI is just not capable of because it cannot like uh, go through some abstract reasoning to answer any of our questions. It mainly just uses, as Alizad said, like logic and algorithms. That's what I think based on. Yeah, it doesn't have its own independent thinking capacity, as his brother said. Any other thoughts? I don't know. This is just what I think. I don't know if there's any other ideas.
I think that there's another thing that can be added maybe is that Sheikh was mentioning in that, humans have this thing that doesn't change, like a stable base. Whereas like if you can think about AI, depending on what the training set is and depending on what the algorithms are and how to synthesize the information, can you really argue that there is a constant thing that's not in motion, that's not in changing, that's grounded in some higher reality? Maybe you can't. And so that would be a distinction from the way that we have our knowledge base compared to how AI has its knowledge base.
Okay, I'm back. I don't know if you guys were able to have a conversation, if anybody shared any thoughts about it. Bismillah, I'm happy to hear if anybody wants to share their thoughts. What do you guys think about AI? I see Brother Anam Zaidi has put something. Anam, is that okay? Brother Anam, do you want to take up the mic and see what you're sharing on the chat?
Assalamualaikum, sister.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah,
That's
Sister
okay.
Anam.
Yeah, so the idea of AI is pretty much just regurgitation of all of our information that we feed it. So it doesn't have its own independent capacity. It just takes what we give it and just intellectual, like just puts it together in a good format. So it's an added tool, not really replaces the human mind.
So we can't say that it's immaterial knowledge, is what you're saying. It's not the idea that we're talking about when we say that knowledge is something immaterial that the soul has. Soul can think. Thinking is an immaterial action. This is something we'll come to. So there's nothing like that, right, with AI? Everybody else would agree, sister? Anybody else have any other thoughts or comments they want to add to it? Yeah, I mean, that's basically what I had in mind as well. That basically AI is a very, very smart machine. Okay, like a very complicated smart. Okay, so when we use words like smart or intelligence, we're using them now in a different way from this Islamic philosophical usage of the term. In the Islamic term, we're talking about something immaterial, that a soul that has knowledge present in the soul. It has like an image of what it looked at and perceived. And that's one kind of usage of the word knowledge, intelligence, smartness. Here, what we have really is a machine that has been, as Sister said, it's been given input. It's like imagine a computer from 100 years ago. Okay, it was very, very simple. I don't know, like how they used to do computers. There were computers where you would like put in papers and punch. I don't know, it would do things or turn on lights. And would we call that intelligence? Probably not, right? Today, we wouldn't call that intelligence. We wouldn't call that artificial intelligence. What we have today is just like a newer version of that ancient machine, which is much more complex, complicated. But at the end of the day, it's just been programmed to do what it does. And it's not like it really has any understanding of its own. It's not a soul. It's not, there's nothing immaterial there from the Islamic perspective. If anybody wants to add anything, I am happy to hear from you guys. If anybody has more kind of knowledge about AI they want to share with us, or if anybody has any questions overall about these 6 proofs that we've gone through now, alhamdulillah, inshallah, these 6 proofs are more than enough to, somehow conclude that human beings are not just a physical body. Okay, a lot of what the material is, yeah, please go ahead. I saw somebody, I think
Sorry,
somebody.
Sheikh, I have a question. So in the previous lecture as well as today, you talked about some of the proofs being the dreams about the deceased, the near-death experiences, and also testimony from ecstatics and awliya. And so my question is, like, as we are talking about these as proofs, can you explain a little bit on how they're also proofs for someone who has not experienced them directly themselves? And would it
Yeah.
not be like unfair for someone who hasn't had these strong experiences versus someone who has? And so how can it be a proof for other people by extension?
Sure, sure. Here, when I say proof, it's this idea of, again, in epistemology, in the last class, we talked about how you can, like the idea of design by nature. Over there, we talked about how a probability, حساب الاحتمالات or تراكم الاحتمالات. I'm forgetting the English term, but the idea that, when you see so many instances of something, you become certain. Okay, it's not a intellectual, logical proof that's 100% solid, but you reach a level, and we live our lives like this, where when we see something repeatedly happen again and again and again, we're comfortable. Our heart is convinced that, okay, that's going to happen again. And so here we can put together the accounts of, so many people who are truthful, who are telling us that they had a dream where they talked to their dead father. Okay, so like, why wouldn't we believe it? It's, these are people who we would trust, and there's so many instances of them. So that's the idea here.
Great,
There's
thank you very
Shaheen?
much.
No, bro.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. I wanted to ask about the idea about if somebody has a brain injury, or if there's a surgery on the brain, like they basically separate the 2 lobes. I can't remember if it's for some ailment that they sometimes do that, or if somebody has a stroke and there's part of the brain dies. Like there's memories that go away. There's intellect that diminishes. There's capacities that go down. I just wanted to understand like how we can't then at least somehow equate or relate these to the physical brain, because we're changing only the physical brain.
Ahsant. This is going to come up in today's class,
Okay.
so bear with me. And then if you still feel that it's not been answered, then very, very shortly, in fact, I'm coming to
Inshallah.
it. Okay. Okay. If there's any other questions or comments, please go ahead. Otherwise, we'll move on to today's topic. Yeah. So today's topic, inshallah, is the relationship of the immaterial soul with the material body. In fact, the first kind of discussion is exactly what Brother Shaheen was kind of asking about, where we want to talk about the effect that the body has on the soul, or better said, maybe we can say like the soul, it needs the body to do things. Okay, so let's start by looking at this picture. What's happening in this picture? Can somebody tell me? Well, how would we normally explain this? What would we say? How about Brother Masood? What do you see in this picture?
Um, so with the hand that's hitting the water, there is a slight change in the way the soul, sorry, the way the water appears, but it still remains water. We cannot say that it's changed completely different. It remains water. It's just the way it appears has changed.
So for this, what we're interested in is the touching of the water. So what would you say is touching the water?
The hand.
Yeah. So that's
Mm,
normally the way we would talk, right? That's normally what we would say. We would
mm, mm.
attribute the action of touching to the fingertips or to the hand. But actually, if we analyze it and we think about it, and there's different kind of proofs that we can give in Islamic, kind of this Islamic paradigm that we're trying to talk about, that no, the thing that perceives, the thing that touches, the thing that feels is actually the immaterial soul. Okay, bear with me. Let me make a few points and then I'll come back to that. So as you can see on this slide is saying that the body is a medium, and it is actually the soul that is using the body. The body is like the channel that allows the soul to see, to hear, to touch, taste, whatever we're doing. Okay? But why is that the case, that it's not the body that's, or as Brother Masood said, we would normally say, why is that wrong? In our perspective, it is wrong. Why is it wrong to say that the hand is doing the touching or feeling? Because this idea of one proof is to take it back to the second proof that we had talked about, that that I don't know, feeling of touching something is something that's not changing, whereas the physical, like let's say you touched the water, now that sensation that you got, that feeling, that's there in your soul, and you can somehow remember what it felt like, right? But the cells are constantly changing, the physical body is constantly in flux. So it's just one example of how, let's read this slide. It says, when our skin touches something, it appears to be our surface skin that is carrying out the function. But actually, there's more. Okay, so one interesting thing we can see here that has confused even Western scientists to kind of think about, that it's not so straightforward to say the skin is doing the touching, right? What's that? The people who have had amputated hands, they have described a sensation. Let's say, God forbid, somebody's hand is cut off to like their elbow, okay? When their elbow touches something, at least initially, after their hand gets cut off, they think that their fingers are touching something. What does that mean? That means that it's like the same nerves that normally in a normal hand are connected from the fingers all the way down to the elbow that are being triggered. And so, because the person is accustomed to feeling their fingers when those nerves are triggered, initially when their hand is cut off, they think that, oh, my fingers, and then they realize, oh my God, I don't have any fingers. And no, actually, that's now a feeling of my elbow touching something. Okay, let's take it further. In fact, modern science can do things to the brain. Apparently, you can trigger, as Brother Shaheen was kind of indicating this too, maybe, that you can trigger certain things in your brain that give you that sensation that you're feeling something, that you're touching something. Right? So the same way we're not we normally attribute it to the fingertips and to the hand that is touching, but in reality, we can see that no, there's a whole system that goes back. There's nerves that connect up to the brain. In this Islamic paradigm, we would add one more level and we would say, no, it's not just the brain. Science, this is important, science does not have the authority to come and tell us it's just the brain. What can science do? The most that science can do is realize that, okay, the brain is involved in the process. There are nerves, there is activity in the brain, but we have philosophical proofs, like what I tried to explain, that this idea of perception is something immaterial. And therefore, it cannot be explained with the physical body. And so, the physical body is a medium, a means of touching, of looking, smelling, tasting, acting, basically, but it is just a medium. And what is actually perceiving, what is actually stable, what actually remembers that perception, that makes that, I don't know, judgment about what the water feels like when you touch the water, that is your immaterial soul that is doing that. Okay. And so now we have an objection, which Brother Shaheen is basically, I think, exactly what you are saying. That, wait a second, why do we have to say there's an immaterial soul when very clearly we see the physical body is doing it? If we don't have, I don't know, a certain body part, organ of the body, we are no longer able to see without our eyes, without our ears, we cannot hear. Something damages in our brain, we cannot remember properly anymore. So, doesn't that prove that this is purely a physical phenomenon? And the answer is no. It just proves that the soul, in normal circumstances for normal people, the soul needs the body to act. Okay, imagine you're a driver of a car. You can't brake if the car has faulty brakes, right? You know how to brake. It's not like your ability to drive is wrong, but the brakes are not working. So a normal soul, when we die, things change. When people are very, very pious and spiritual mystics, at times even, I mentioned this, that not just Islamic mysticism, even schools of mysticism that are not approved of by the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, they can strengthen a soul such that the soul can act without the usage of the body. But for normal people, you need the body to act. Okay, so that's the answer, basically. We can tell people who are materialists that, okay, why do you say the hand is touching when the hand, it's really the brain, right? Isn't it really the brain? And so the same way that you see the brain as being the end point of this process, we say that no, the end point is something beyond the brain. And we have philosophical proofs that show that, like what we said, that it's not a physical phenomenon that we're talking about. So there has to be an immaterial soul that is behind the scenes doing everything. Okay. Brother Shaheen, does that
Thanks.
answer?
What if somebody doesn't have sight, or if they don't have hearing, or if they don't have um, speech? So, yeah, maybe not speech, but then would you say that the soul can still see around? Like they still have dreams with images and
It's possible. It's possible that people can perceive without using their body. Okay, like for a normal blind person, maybe that's not the case. But like a very, very pious person can see things like that story we just read about Sayyid Hashim al-Haddad. He saw something that wasn't a physical reality. It wasn't like he saw it with his physical eyes. And this is the way we explain a lot of stories and ahadith and verses of the Quran. People, maybe Maryam sees angel Jibrail. What does that mean? It was not a physical thing that somebody next to her would have seen. It was like, because of her pure soul, she had another way of seeing things, that her soul was able to see something that was not a physical phenomenon. Yeah. Brother Masood?
So Sheikh, now when we say that the soul is present, stable, and uniform,
Mm-hmm.
then then what then what is changing when we say that a soul is developing? Like for example, the story of Sayyid Hashim Haddad. He of course developed his soul to be able to achieve that separation. So we have this concept of uniformity, but then we also have this concept of change, this development of the soul. And I
Yeah.
sometimes I really struggle trying to grasp the two together.
So I think it's just like that, that there is a dimension of us that is stable and constant, that identity of who we are, that, when we look, this is interesting to think about, that when we think of the past, we think of normally events in the past, or, images that we saw in the past. But the identity of who I am is not different in the past. It's not something that's time bound, that I think of, my identity in the past and my identity now. That is something stable. So there's some two different things here. There is an aspect of us that is immaterial and can develop. Somebody can become more pious. They can learn more knowledge. Knowledge is something immaterial that's somehow added to their soul. But there is an aspect of us that is stable. Okay. Okay. So yeah, this was with regards to how the body influences the soul. So how does the body influence the soul? The body is the means of the soul interacting, acting in the physical world. Okay, there's two terms I'm going to use here. They're important Arabic terms: jawarih and jawanih. You might remember it from Dua al-Kumail at the end. قو على خدمتك جوارحي واشتد على العزيمة جوانحي. Jawarih are your physical body. To act with your jawarih means that you walk, I don't know, see, talk, do something. Whereas there's an idea of how we can act internally as well. Things like thinking, things like loving, things like feeling thankfulness. These are actions that the soul can do internally. Okay. Anyways, we'll come back to this, but the first idea that we now discussed is that the relationship of how the body affects the soul. The body, for example, is the means that the soul can see and hear and act in the physical world. It's a limitation. Okay, this is a limitation of most people who are weak, like us, who are not at high levels. We cannot act in the physical world without our body. Okay, but now there's another idea as well, that the body is also somehow driven by the soul. When we do something, it is our soul that first makes the decision that we want to talk, move. So our soul can do different kinds of actions. One are external actions, jawarih actions, where our soul decides that, okay, I'm going to talk, I'm going to stand up and walk. And the other thing is that the soul can decide to do actions that are themselves internal and immaterial, like thinking, for example, loving, I don't know, thinking, things like that. Okay, so there's this idea that the soul, as Brother Masood mentioned, definitely the soul can grow in its power. And the stronger a soul is, the more effect it can have on its own body, on even people around it. A pious individual is able to somehow inspire other people. They are able to push their body, even though, you know, the body might be weak, but because the soul is very determined to do something, they will still be able to do it. We have a hadith from Imam Sadiq, peace be upon him. ما ضعف بدن عما قويت عليه النية. That the body will not weaken when one's intention is strong. So this is the other way. So first we were talking about how the body affects the soul. Now we're saying no, the soul also has a very strong effect on the body. It is the driving force that is doing all the actions that the body does. So let's look at some examples. Yeah,
Sheikh,
go ahead.
sorry,
If anybody has a question, yeah, please.
yes, welcome. Sorry, can you please repeat the hadith from 60 Bab?
Yeah, sure. It was saying
Thank
that
you.
the body will not weaken when one's intention is strong. Imagine Ayatollah Bahjat, 90 years old, praying namaz shab for 2 hours and worshiping God. Like, what is it? His body must be weak at that old age. He must want to sleep. But his soul is very powerful. It's pushing the body to do what it wants to do.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so we can just compare that when we say the effect of the body on the soul, we're saying things like, I see, I need my eyes to see. I hear through my ears. I feel hungry because my stomach needs food. I feel happy. Okay, so this is an important point that, you know, I don't know, like psychology and Western science, they may be medicine, they may have a lot, and they definitely have a lot of success, but they are analyzing things purely from the physical. So they might, like, for example, chop up the brain of a dead, depressed person, and then they'll say, okay, look, he was depressed. He had all of these kind of hormones in his brain. So that is what caused the depression. These hormones are the cause of the depression. Let's now make a chemical medicine that will go against these hormones and remove them. And that's how we will deal with depression. An Islamic perspective wouldn't deny that, but it would say there's also something else there. There's also a soul. A soul can be the cause of happiness or sadness as well. Okay, so this is something important to keep in mind, that in our perspective, we have another aspect of the human being. So those were, seeing, hearing, hungry, happiness. We can look at it from the perspective of the body on the soul. Okay, but there is a lot to like say here. Of course, that's why we should be healthy. That's why we should have, I don't know, like halal relationships, okay, and get married and all the physical body needs to be satisfied in a halal way. Okay, there is an effect that has, but there is something else as well. There is a soul that is more important. Sometimes we need to sacrifice the body for the soul, give importance to the soul. Anyways, the influence of the soul on the body, for example, I want to move. I make the will to move my muscles. Even sometimes I could just be thinking. I said thinking is a purely immaterial thing, but it may have an effect on my body. I'm thinking about food and saliva starts to come out on my tongue. There's this deep relationship between the body and the soul. They affect one another. Feeling discomfort, depression, and that causes you to be weak. Okay, feeling embarrassed, your face becomes red. These are examples of how something started in the soul. It was a feeling that was in the soul, but it then became apparent on the body. Okay, we're coming to an end of our time. The last discussion that I want to have, which is really, really important, that scholars of akhlaq, and some of these scholars of akhlaq were philosophers who, I think I may have mentioned this, they subscribed to a kind of older understanding of Islamic philosophy, but even there's a lot of truth there that they were talking about. What was this? They were saying that the body is a vehicle. Now they had a different understanding from Islamic philosophy after Mullah Sadra. After Mullah Sadra, he explained that no, the soul and the body are connected in a more deeper way. Prior to him, the Islamic philosophy generally considered these things as two separate realities. The way the hadiths or Islamic tradition kind of tells us that the spirit is breathed into the body at 4 months at a certain age in the mother's womb, the soul enters the body. Of course, Mullah Sadra has an explanation there, but that kind of understanding that was there before Mullah Sadra was this, that there's two separate realities, and the body is your steed, is your mount that you have to ride. The reality of who you are is an immaterial soul, two separate realities, and the soul is just riding on the body. Okay? But that then becomes like a whole kind of reason to understanding the Islamic laws and Islamic akhlaq. And there's a lot then that teachers of akhlaq would try to explain that, for example, one of the things that Islam gives a lot of importance to is the niyyah of an individual. We would say that, if you have a good niyyah, you will be rewarded, even if you don't get a chance to do the action. But at the same time, Islam also gives a lot of importance to the action itself, that it wants us to do prayers and fasting and give money. These are all actions that we have to do with our body. And so there is this idea that the soul is riding the body, but then, it needs the body to act as well. To a certain extent, the niyyah is really important in Islam because it's the soul that's really what matters. If somebody has a good niyyah, that means that their soul was a good soul and they will be rewarded just for that niyyah. But at the same time, Islam wants us to pray and fast and give money and do all of these things for which we need the physical body. So that soul somehow is riding on the horse of the body, and it needs that horse to take it to that destination that it wants to go to, that proximity to Allah, that purity that it needs to attain. So there's a lot to be said here, that this kind of outlook that the soul is riding on the body, it then explains a lot of Islamic teachings to us, that we need the body to act. That's why we want to take care of the body. That's why we want to, Islam tells us to live a normal life in society with family, but then that allows the soul to perfect itself. And by obeying God through the body, we perfect the soul. But at the end of the day, the soul is what's important. Like I said, for example, we see that in the whole idea of niyyah. If somebody is doing a good action, but out of riyah, then it won't benefit them, because the soul, which is what's of primary importance, is not correct in what it's doing. Anyway, there's a lot of kind of explanation of Islamic tradition and teachings based on this understanding of the soul and the body, which is not completely wrong, but after Mullah Sadra, he somehow modified it. And he said that no, these are not two separate realities. Rather, it's one reality that starts off as a physical body, and then at a certain stage, it develops an immaterial dimension. And later on, when you die, you shed that lower physical aspect of who you are. Anyways, guys, these are inshallah some important points. We'll continue the discussion next week about the perfection of the soul, and then comparing some of the aspects of our soul and our own kind of reality to Allah. Like I mentioned a few times, that this pondering on our immaterial soul is an opening kind of point, a entry point into understanding the immaterial world. And some of the aspects that we want to later talk about with regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can understand if we look at our soul and then realize that that's the way God also is. Inshallah. Okay, wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala tahirin. Time has come to an end. I'm happy to stick around if anybody has any questions. Otherwise, you guys are free to go. Sister Shiza, bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Can you kindly just briefly explain the hadith of Imam Jawad that you have mentioned in the end of the
Oh, yeah.
slide?
Yeah, it's this idea of how the heart is what's really important. Okay, so I was saying that Islamic, even though there's so much importance in Islamic on laws and actions and praying and fasting and doing things, but still we have also Islamic teachings like this hadith that show us that the soul is what's really important. For example, how much emphasis is there on love and hatred? Having love of awliya of Allah, hating the enemies of Allah. These are things that are actions of the soul that are very, very important in kind of progress, spiritual progress in Islam. So I think this hadith is somehow indicating that going closer to Allah by means of the heart is important, is more effective than just simply worrying about the body alone. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, guys, inshallah. Take care, and we'll be in touch. Next week will be the last session, inshallah. Ya amanallah.